It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Great to see the Asconi members that are here, and a pleasure to be part of this STEMinar series at College of DuPage. What I'd like to talk to you about tonight is about 20 years of my career as a paleontologist. I got interested in this time frame of the late Devonian period. So we're talking about what was happening on Earth from about 370 to 390 million years ago. So we're looking at a long slice of time and a very consequential slice of time. As you see from my title, this is the time frame when you essentially go from finned to the first limbed vertebrates. So although we think of all of this diversity of fishes in the Devonian, just at the end of the Devonian, we're starting to see the first limbed animals as just one branch of the groups of vertebrates on Earth. So to move forward, there's a lot of different ways to sort of look at geological time, this time spiral here. I'm going to try to use the arrow to guide us through. I hope you can see this reasonably well. So if we start with the present and we start moving back through the age of mammals and into the age of dinosaurs and continue back past the big extinctions at the end of the Permian, beginning of the Triassic, we look to the Devonian, all the way back here, frequently called the age of fishes. And as I said, we're looking at that slice of time toward the end of the Devonian period. If you look pre-Devonian, okay, so here's our arrow. Notice how we don't have anything green heading down 1 billion years ago, 2 billion years ago, 3, all the way back to 4.6 billion years ago with the history of, with the beginning of the Earth. So as we move forward, life became finally multicellular, you know, getting into the about 600 million years ago or so. And then as we get into the Devonian, the diversity of vertebrates starts to diversify, but the greening of the Earth was a very important event at that period in time. Plants essentially began to colonize land. And I hope I can make the argument today that it was the colonization of land plants that really set the stage for the diversification of vertebrates onto land and in freshwater ecosystems. So there we are. That's our time frame. I started my work in Pennsylvania. I was a student at the University of Pennsylvania. I had been working at the Academy of Natural Sciences. I was looking for a dissertation project, and a guy named Keith Thompson was the president of our museum at the time, and he had done a little bit of work out here in the Catskill Formation, which is Devonian-age. It's essentially, some of this blue color here is the Catskill Formation. I'm going to circle north-central Pennsylvania. This is where we tend to get the best outcrops and the best Catskill Formation deposits for preserving the kinds of fish and this late Devonian time frame. And this is what we're looking at for the most part. Highway road cuts. Pennsylvania, like out here, natural exposures are rare. If you find natural exposures, they're deeply weathered. So we love the highway department, and we encourage highway building whenever possible. And when they're cutting through this basically flat-lying parts of the Pocono Plateau and the Allegheny Plateau out into north-central Pennsylvania, they often are exposing this Catskill Formation. So here's a cut just north of Williamsport, Pennsylvania. The rock was removed from this side of this hill, and very nicely they spread it out to build a new roadbed on. And so we were able to get in here, not so much when they were doing the construction, although if you make do the right kind of political things and talk to the right people, sometimes you can get in there during construction. But in this case, we just searched and found lots and lots and lots of examples of late Devonian life in this rock that is spread out, that they put the roadbed on. I don't know if I mentioned, but the Catskill Formation is primarily non-marine deposition, so stream deposits during the late Devonian. And that's really the ecosystems that we are most interested in searching for these sort of evolutionary changes leading toward the origin of limbed animals. And I'll explain that more fully as we move forward. So, highway road cuts, wonderful stuff. On that very cut that we saw in the last picture, I'd like to introduce you to a lobe-finned fish. So, you can look at the diversity of vertebrates and things we call fishes, basically aquatic vertebrates through time, and there's lots of different forms. There are those that are leading to the sort of all of the fish that we eat and all the fish that we might catch when we go fishing. There are groups that are leading toward all the sharks and the rays, what we call cartilaginous fish. And there are groups of fish that are very primitive that have no living ancestors. Armored fish, the Placa Derms, acanthodians, spiny sharks, and jawless fish, the agnathans. And all of this is kind of sorting itself out in the Devonian period. Lobe-finned fish are the group that I've focused on mostly. They are the group that through the late Devonian give rise to the first limbed animals. And I show this fin skeleton. Okay, so here is the specimen. It's about the size of a ping pong racket. Here's a drawing of the specimen. And this is a pectoral fin. I'm holding up my pectoral fin. I hope by the end of the talk, you're happy with the idea that these are essentially pectoral fins and pelvic fins. We are just highly modified lobe-finned fish. And our appendages are now, we call them arms and legs, but they're essentially fins. The exact same skeletons that we have in our body are present at this period of time in these lobe-finned fish in the late Devonian. By that I mean a humerus, here's our upper appendage, a radius and an ulna, elements that would become wrist bones, and elements that will become digits. Now those are all tied within a fin web. There's these bones called fin rays that are part of the web for essentially aquatic living so that you have some surface area to move your fins and to steer through water. And I put this little cartoon in down here. We all love Gary Larson cartoons. Great moments in evolution. Great moments in evolution happen when pre-existing structures get used for a new function. And a new function is often when there's a new ecological opportunity, because we know that environments change, that ecosystems change as other parts of the biosphere are changing. So that when there's a new opportunity to make a living in a new way, this is a bit anthropomorphized, but organisms are always looking for ways to make a living, to get food, to reproduce, etc. And when there's new opportunities out there, sometimes old structures get used for those new opportunities. In fact, oftentimes. So this basic structure in a lobe-finned fish was perfectly good for living in water, doing its thing, swimming, paddling, all the rest. And there's lobe-finned fish today. The coelacanth and the lungfish are lobe-finned fish, fully aquatic animals. But in the Devonian, as ecosystems changed, there was something new. There was a new need. There was a different way to use those same appendages. Just like these fish had to think about what to do now once the ball went on land. Okay. Pennsylvania sites. This is Red Hill. It's near Lock Haven, Pennsylvania. It's one of the most diverse sites in the world to put together what a late Devonian freshwater ecosystem looked like. We essentially work these lower beds all the way through here. There's a sequence of about 1 meter thick of deposits that preserve bone beautifully. Huge diversity of critters. I won't ask you to read all these, but I can hopefully show you Placa Derms, so several groups of Placa Derms living in these freshwater streams in the late Devonian. Acanthodians, a group that is totally extinct now, but very interesting. Gyracanthus is the most common one. Early sharks, early ray-finned fish, and a large diversity of these lobe-finned fish. The Devonian was truly a time when lobe-finned fish were radiating and filling all kinds of different niches. Among those lobe-finned fish are these forms that we generally call ichthyostagans. And essentially, those are early tetrapods. But I've just pointed out that they belong to the group of lobe-finned fish. And so we are seeing within the group of lobe fins, some of them were taking those appendages, which previously had been used mostly for living in aquatic settings, and really changing the way they're oriented on the body, maybe contacting the substrate, going through shallow swampy habitats, really specializing for something different, sort of these new ecosystems at the time. And those are what we call early tetrapods. So we have a number of early tetrapods out here. Also, we have some trigonotarbid arachnids. So these would have been land-living arthropods, spider-like forms, and millipedes. So we're putting together a picture now of not just a couple of interesting fish, but the ecosystem that they lived in. And a whole lot of plants, a big diversity of plants. And this is new in the world. The late Devonian was the, I don't mean this literally, the flowering of plants, where the diversity increasing incredibly. We can talk a little bit about what were these floodplains like. And here's a cross-section, or excuse me, like a block diagram. This, you might see the outline of Pennsylvania here. And Ohio out here. All right, there's Lake Erie, there's kind of where Lake Erie is, and so we're all the way out here, Chicago way. But there was the seaway to the west, mountains to the east, and floodplains. Basically erosion coming off of those mountains. The Appalachians weren't even formed yet. These are the Acadian mountains to the east. This was the orogeny, the mountain building event. That was sort of, there have been 3 big mountain building events that hit the East Coast between about 420 and 300 million years ago. And this is the middle one, called the Acadian orogeny. So these mountains were coming up, they were shedding sediments to the west, and Red Hill and our Catskill Formations things are basically the deposits of these meandering streams moving across these floodplains, carrying sand, silt, mud out toward Ohio. And out in Ohio is where you get the Cleveland Shale and some of these beautiful big shallow marine Placa Derms and things out there. So if we were to think about what those floodplains might have looked like, we can use this modern analog. And the key thing about this picture is that it's green, that there are plants in this ecosystem. And when you think about it, you can have mountains and sediments shedding off of mountains, but if you don't have plants on those floodplains, those sediments, you see it in places like Greenland today, you just have wide braided floodplains, very unstable channels and so forth. But once plants start to put roots into the soil, they create levees along the sides of channels and things, all of a sudden, plants have created a much more diverse set of environments on these floodplains. Previously, it would be pretty monotonous. You kind of have the channels, and they're moving quickly, and a lot of sediment moving through. But plants anchor the sediment. They create these levees that then, the sediment builds up on the levees, leaving the floodplains at a lower elevation, so that when there is a flood, you create these ponds and these small deltas behind and such. So all of a sudden in the Devonian, we went from having basically kind of monotonous floodplains without much holding down the sediment and without a lot of real productive ecosystems to a variety of productive ecosystems, swamps and wetlands and delta systems and channels and a whole variety of things. And I think part of that diversity of ecosystems is what was driving the diversity of new forms of lobe-finned fish and other things as they specialized into those ecosystems. So really, I look back and we can thank the fact that there are tetrapods on Earth, limbed animals on Earth, including us. We can thank the plants. So just make sure you thank a plant today. Okay, the kinds of stuff that we see at Red Hill, this is lobe-finned fish, this is placoderm element, this is the plant material we get, more small placoderms. This is a little ray-finned fish, that's the group of most fish that we see today, but this is very early in their history. A lower jaw of an early tetrapod, there's some very unique and derived features of this, and a shoulder girdle, basically the bones that connect to the fin and help the animal kind of use that appendage. And actually, we can even see from this bone, which is not terribly much like the aquatic versions, this is as you start seeing more use of that appendage for moving through shallow water. And even this one little bone, you could hold this in the palm of your hand, it's the humerus. This humerus from Red Hill essentially really can teach us an awful lot about the orientation of these very earliest limbed animals, the connections for muscles along some of these big ridges, the articulations at the elbow and how the lower limb would be held. So this humerus was on the cover of Science, which is amazing that you know, one little bone, but that's paleontology. You can really make some interpretation. We didn't name it a new species or anything like that. We can't say that, but functionally, it was very informative about what was going on in the Devonian, and very clear that what was going on was some innovation, some new experimentation into new ecosystems. Here's a drawing. This was done for National Geographic, actually based on Red Hill, and it sort of reviews everything I've just been talking about. Plants were starting to diversify on land and really add to the biomass. Forests, these are the first forests. This is the greening of the earth up on these floodplains. And there were big plants. This is Archaeopteris, which is a pretty common form at the time. There were ferns and other understory plants. And when you think about it, they're catching sunlight, they're decaying, they're helping to create soil, their roots are weathering and creating soil as well. That detritus is coming into streams. Then there are vertebrates and invertebrates that are feeding on that detritus. There are then carnivores that are eating those detritivores, and there are bigger carnivores like this lobe-finned fish called Hyneria that are eating those. And then there are even some lobe-finned fish that are developing appendages that might help them move through swampy, shallow habitats. And so this is the reconstruction of some of the Red Hills, the tetrapods at Red Hill. And of course, the artists had to have one coming out on land. I can't tell you how much these animals may have used the land. Maybe it was a way to escape predation. Maybe it was a way to climb over sandbanks to get into ponds that are over in the floodplains and stuff. But nonetheless, very interesting changes to the fins and other parts of the body in this case. So I like to point out that you've been to a place like this. You've gone fishing or swimming or canoeing in a place like this. But this kind of ecosystem did not exist before the Devonian. And the Devonian, you know, let's say roughly 400 million years ago, that's only the last 10% of Earth history. So we've got to realize that this is essentially a new ecosystem, and the development of this ecosystem exploded vertebrate life. It really sort of set the stage for everything that we have today. So if we just quickly look at diversity on sort of a tree of life, on the left side we have geologic time, about 500 million years ago to the present. Across the top, we have what we call the crown groups of chordates, vertebrates, and we're very familiar with mammals, reptiles, including birds and amphibians. If I put the Devonian time frame on there, you can see not only do we have the origin of tetrapods right during the Devonian, but some of the other groups, these are other lobe-finned fish here, lungfish and coelacanth, they're really diversifying and starting to really much more abundant in the late Devonian. And these other groups, ray-finned fish and cartilaginous fish, they're also going through some changes in the Devonian and starting to dominate. Yet at the same time, the Devonian was the end of some of these more primitive types of things, Placa Derms, acanthodians, agnathans, jawless fish. And so it's really, the Devonian is a significant turnover. Think of it as sort of the sorting out of the early experiments in being an aquatic vertebrate, and you sort of, some groups don't make it, but other groups do, to diversify to the groups of vertebrates that we see on Earth today. And I'd like to just quickly focus on this one thing. We call it the Stem Tetrapods, and it's a very important lineage leading to the earliest limbed animals. And that's particularly what I'd like to focus on for much of this talk, because that's where the origin of limbed vertebrates occurs, in the groups that fit into the tree in here. Essentially animals that are more closely related to limbed animals than they are to any of the living lobe-finned fish like a lungfish. So more derived, more advanced, more features like limbed animals have. All right. And to put that sort of in a cartoonish way, we're looking at the transition from an animal like this, a lobe-finned fish, to an animal like this, an early tetrapod. And it seems like that's a pretty big jump, and it's true. We're trying to find the intermediates, the transitional stages in this sort of transition. And the kinds of changes are, look, they have pelvic fins. Those pelvic fins have the basic limb structure in it, but they're held behind the animal. They're essentially for paddling and steering. But there are pectoral fins and pelvic fins that then get modified to reach under the animal, out and under. So then we get the pelvic limb and pectoral limb. We change the girdles, which are the supports for those appendages, which aren't very robust in the fishes. We open up a neck so that the head can move independently from the shoulders, because in these fishes, you're essentially a torpedo. The head and the shoulders and the body are kind of all connected up. Rather than being a torpedo shaped, the head becomes much more flattened. So we really wanted to learn more about the transitional forms, going from a lobe-finned fish to a limbed version. And it seems like a big change, but we're going to find the fossils that help us understand that. This was actually my undergraduate geology textbook. And let me see, this would have been about 1979 that I was at Franklin and Marshall College. This was my textbook. In 1999, so 20 years later, I pulled this off my shelf because I was talking to a colleague, Neil Shubin, and we said, well, where else could we find some Devonian rock on Earth besides all the work we'd done in Pennsylvania? Where else could we find Devonian rock that's unexplored where we might get some good material relevant to this fin to limb transition? We had been working in this Catskill Red Beds. This map just essentially shows where there are stream deposits, non-marine, we call them red beds, in North America. So the Catskills was kind of understood, Catskill Project. East Greenland was studied by the Danes and the British, and more work could be done there. But this set of red beds, up in the Arctic islands, although they had geologically been characterized, no one had gone in there to look for fossil fish. This was perfect. This was exactly what we would have hoped for. Oh, we didn't just shoot in the dark completely. We went to the stratigraphers, the geologists up at the Canadian Geological Survey who had done the mapping up there. And they said, oh yeah, we see fish scrap. That's kind of all they care about, is like, oh yeah, there's a piece of bone. And understood, that's what's on the surface, or just scrappy pieces of bone. But that gave us some confidence, at least, that there would be stuff up there. So in 1999, we organized our first trip to go up to the Nunavut territory of Canada. And that's what this is. Nunavut was established that very same year. It was a portion of what used to be called Northwest Territory. It's essentially an Inuit homeland for the native people. It's north of Hudson Bay, up here across Baffin Island, up onto Ellesmere Island and such. So it's a huge area, hardly any people. We fly up there by going from Ottawa to Iqaluit, across Baffin Island, up to Resolute Bay, which is up here above the Arctic Circle. Interestingly, this is the Northwest Passage, which in all the years we've been going up there, there's less and less ice there, and they actually, a few years ago, they were starting to set up monitoring. There's going to be ships going through. Forget the Panama Canal. We can go up north now and through, which is an interesting development. Not quite yet, but it's on the horizon. And then from Resolute Bay, we would get in small planes. Excuse me, you see the arrows, and we've surveyed across these Arctic islands. This is the terrain. It's wonderful. I mean, it's just beautiful. It's cold. We're there in the summer. It's, 30 to 40 degrees. The weather does get bad. Sometimes it's windy. But it's just spectacular and exciting to get there. We fly in these twin otter planes. They can land on anything flat, so often on these beaches along the side of the sea ice. So we can get close to the sites we're interested in. We have, using geological maps and aerial photos, we predetermine, approximately where we want to be, kind of the valleys that we want to be in. And then we get helicopters. They follow us. We bring all our gear in planes, and then the helicopters come in and shuttle us in smaller loads up to where we want to be. Bell 206 helicopter. So we do this in the summer, about a 6-week trip. I like to point out, especially to my wife, that the previous explorers who had done any geological work up there, they were Norwegians, and it was the Fram Expedition, exactly 100 years earlier from when we went up there, and their expedition was 4 years long. They spent 3 winters frozen into the ice. The Fram was a The Norwegians were very smart about polar exploration. They built ships that wouldn't get crushed when the pack ice froze around it. And so the Fram had these braces going across it and actually just sort of lifted as the ice went through. These guys collected Devonian fish. They mapped and they collected plants. They collected all sorts of stuff. But they collected Devonian fish up there too, 100 years earlier. Some of the same places that we went. Well, at least one of the same places that we spent a little bit of time. So I like to give them credit. So this is actually the valley up there on Ellesmere Island. This is the Fram Formation, it's called, named after that ship. Late Devonian sediments. You can see kind of ridges and lower spots. This is classic kind of topography for channel deposits, overbank deposits, meaning mud and silt channels, muds and silts channels, muds and silts. So these are the deposits of meandering streams, just what we would hope we would look for. Out here, right on this ridge line, I think it's going to pop in, yes. This was a site that we found. We surveyed several different areas on Ellesmere. This was the last area we did on one of the seasons in year 2000, actually. And we found an interesting enough site there that we came back to it the next time we were there in 2002. And I'll just show you some pictures of sort of developing that site. This was the first, when we first found it. And the way we find vertebrate sites is to walk those valleys and look for debris, fish scrap, essentially, like the stratigraphers we're talking about. And when we find scrap on a surface, especially if it's abundant, we can follow it up and find what layer it might be eroding from. So over thousands of years, that layer has been breaking apart, and the bone that might be within it will break into pieces, but it's still recognizable as fossil bone. And so this is where a couple of guys had found the site, and the next day we all went back, and we were picking, because there was a ton of stuff there, we were picking up things from the surface, and we were able to identify a layer that continued into the ground that was really rich with bone. So clearly all of this had come from that layer. Kinds of stuff we pick up on the surface are things like these lungfish tooth plates. So durable elements. They weathered out of that layer, but they stayed together, and we could at least identify that. But we wanted to get articulated animals, meaning a skull with jaws, you know, kind of more complete, or a body. When we went back again, we took a gas-powered jackhammer. So we essentially started to strip mine. Because these beds were dipping and the hillside was coming like this, we had to take a wedge of rock off above. There weren't fossil bones in that wedge of rock that we removed above, and we knew where the layer with the bones was projecting. And in fact, in this picture, we had laid out some yellow tape, so we didn't dig into it. But we're essentially digging, strip mining down to that layer, and then we'll get the little tools out, and we'll start working through that layer. And if you notice, that's a little plaster jacket that's covering something we found, probably a jaw or something like that. A lot of different animals at this particular site. Notice that the bed is tipping down toward us. That's why it was a challenge to take off the overlaying rock. I like this picture. These are, first of all, two of my very important colleagues, Neil Shubin in the orange jacket and Ferris Jenkins. And I just like the picture because we were starting to find some good fossils. And even when it's 35 degrees and drizzly and windy, you're just freezing and uncomfortable. If you're finding good fossils, you know, we're all happy campers, you know. And so this was wrapping up some interesting stuff. And in fact, it's wrapping up one of the most important fossils that has ever come out of the work that we're doing. Here's that site. Here's that hole in there. There's the hole in the ground that we dug. This is what, you know, you saw us doing some of our excavation. These are some other plaster jackets. That jacket right up top there has this thing. I'm going to put a circle on it. There are two jaws coming together to a chin, and there is part of a skull. So it's a skull that's laying on its back with two lower jaws still in place. So when you see things that are in articulation, meaning it's not just the body that's fallen apart, where you actually see the skull bones next to each other, you think maybe it's going to be complete, maybe it's still together. And sure enough, We wrapped this whole thing in plaster as much as we could. We couldn't take out pieces much bigger than like a pizza because we have to put plaster over the top of it. It gets heavy. The plaster doesn't dry well up there. We actually eventually have to load that into a helicopter, and the cargo bay in the helicopter is pretty small and things. So it's not like collecting dinosaurs where we can get a backhoe in there and move things around and get trucks over there and such. But that's okay, because these animals are pretty small. So remember that two sides of the lower jaw and that snout. There it is again, okay? Two sides of the lower jaw and snout. So this jacket safely, I'm glad to say, made its way back to Philadelphia, and we started to do the fossil preparation. That was the view when we started to open up what was actually facing down first. There we see a shovel-shaped head with two orbits. A lot of the sediment has been taken out of the plaster. This is the plaster that we wrapped it in up there. So we're seeing a shovel-shaped head with orbits high, very short back of the skull. We're not seeing any bones between the skull and the shoulder girdles. We're seeing scales on the back. We're seeing fin bones attached to those shoulder girdles. So we were getting really excited. This was exactly what we had hoped for. And as I said, we have a whole diversity of animals from this site, but this is the thing that we first put all of our attention to. I got to give props to the fossil preparators, amazing people. I'm sure there's some people here who do fossil preparation. You know that it takes amazing patience and persistence and skill. Really, it's wonderful. And I have a guy named Fred Mullison in Philly who is just one of the best, especially on this Devonian stuff. So that's that animal. That is the first specimen of what we named Tiktaalik roseae. And this is the very one that you saw in the field there with the two lower jaws on the top of the skull and the little bit of snout that we originally saw. The front half of the animal is about that big. The skull is about this long. We ended up finding 4 specimens with skulls, shoulder girdles, parts of fins, and then lots more isolated specimens like a single jaw or a little bit of a snout or something. So the deposit seemed to have relatively complete individuals, but also a lot of disarticulated, broken up individuals. But this was the one that we started working on, and doing paleontology like this is really a comparative anatomy exercise. So we came up with this drawing of all the separate bones in the skull of the animal we named Tiktaalik. We compared it to an early tetrapod. This one is a Kenthostega from Greenland, a very complete form. But it is very similar to the stuff that we were finding in Pennsylvania, although we don't have anything nearly as complete in Pennsylvania. But we also compared it to some finned forms, some lobe-finned fish down the lineage, but particularly ones that had relatively flattened heads like Tiktaalik from the Baltics, from southern Canada, the Gaspé Peninsula. And Tiktaalik, just looking at the skull alone, there were a lot of similarities to these more primitive forms, but a few similarities, especially in the area behind the orbits, to a more derived form. So in other words, we could see it was a mosaic of features. Some features were more like the precursors, the more primitive things. Some features were more like the descendants, the more derived things, are the words we use for these things. And that helped us a lot. That helped us understand where Tiktaalik fit in a tree, like the ones I've been showing you. This is just, we've been doing 3D scans now. We've done CT scans, CAT scans of these, a lot of these fossils as well. And this is just the ventral side, some interesting features that we saw. Palate, a very primitive palate, but a very advanced brain case. We see ribs all through here on the lower side, basically underneath the scales. Here's the specimen showing all of the scales, the shoulder girdles beautifully preserved here. And of course, the orbits up high and so forth and so on. The skull is slightly crushed, but probably only about 30%. So it's a little bit lower than it would be a little bit higher. Another individual. You might recognize 2 lower jaws coming together to the symphysis. This one we wrapped in plaster. We had seen it from above. We have gill supports. So they had a branchial skeleton for good breathing, water-breathing gills. Interestingly, this specimen also preserves back here a humerus, which is that upper arm bone. Very interesting, and this one isn't prepped, but once this is prepped, we saw just every detail of muscle attachments. Like I was talking about on the Catskill Formation specimen I showed you. You got a humerus, you can interpret all kinds of aspects of that appendage. But not only did we have a humerus, we had other fin bones as well from several individuals. This is another specimen showing humerus, radius, ulna, and wrist bones. And importantly, still enveloped with those fin rays, those long, narrow rods. So still with some aspects of a web. So clearly still in the water, but probably not, you know, this appendage was not designed for quick swimming, quick moving up and down through the water column and stuff. It looks like it was designed more for contact on the substrate. It's oriented slightly differently, and so forth, so the muscle attachments and such. So we think Tiktaalik was specializing toward what we were talking about with early tetrapods, maybe shallow water habitats. That's just the fin on a similar tree. When we were looking at the skulls, we were also, you know, putting Tiktaalik in context with some of the more primitive lobe fins and some of the more advanced or derived ones, early tetrapods. And you'll note that these fin rays have been lost in things that we call limbs. That gray area, when we talk about a fin and a limb, I think most of us have concept about what those are. But in the Devonian, I'm going to say I don't know if it's a fin or a limb sometimes. Like, well, how do we define that? They're all being used one way or another. So I would say it's the loss of these fin rays, these lepidotrichia, that define the difference between a fin and a limb. Just, it's an arbitrary decision because in nature there would have been lots and lots of intermediates there. All right, so this all came out in Nature. A couple of papers in this issue and the cover of it, which was really nice. And this just shows that there was great interest in this at the time. That this became the best intermediate, and still is the best intermediate to fill in this transition from aquatic lobe-finned fish and the earliest tetrapods. There's Tiktaalik sitting in there. And just to talk about fins for a moment, we had seen Sauropteris, this kind of classic lobe-finned fish. This is the skeletal drawings that we were able to make of Tiktaalik and all the detailed nature. And I'd just like to point out that the basic pattern, as I mentioned earlier, humerus, radius, ulna, ankles, digits, you've got that same exact pattern in your arms. Every tetrapod, every limbed animal has that same pattern, whether it's a bat or a pterosaur or a bird or a dinosaur, a mammal, a reptile, a penguin. All tetrapods, all animals derive from that primitive late Devonian thing, basically keep the same design, unless they've lost limbs completely like snakes have and things, or modified them a lot. But even a whale, even something that's modified, or a sea turtle, still got that same structure in there. We've looked in great detail at the shoulders, the shoulder girdle, and I just would like to point out, this is looking from the belly side. This is the clavicle. Look at this. This is called the scapulocoracoid. And in lobe-finned fish, it's a very small element that the fin plugs into that kind of just helps the fin steer back behind. In Tiktaalik, it is a massive element, as if this fin had to have something to buttress against in the body. It's massive. The glenoid fossa, the shoulder joint, points below and a little bit laterally, not fully laterally like a tetrapod, but a little bit laterally. So you're really doing something different with this appendage. And we did learn about the pelvic appendage as well. You recognize that this is the specimen that I've been focusing on, the first one we did. Remember I said we couldn't take big jackets? Well, we hoped there would be more in the rock behind. This was the jacket that we took. So we took another block behind, and when we finally prepared it, did the work to dig the bones out, we found parts of a pelvic fin and part of a pelvis, you know, the girdle itself that would hold that pelvic fin. So essentially the leg of this animal. There's the pelvis with a really nice, the acetabulum is the socket, where the femur would fit into. We never found a femur, unfortunately. We're not sure what elements these are of the pelvic fin, but believe me, we went back to this site. We worked the site for several years after all of this. We found more of the same, but we never found a femur or a hind fin. So one of those things, and just can't keep trying at this point. So importantly, understanding the pelvis of Tiktaalik showed us something and clarified kind of a paradigm, changed a paradigm. If we were looking at a lobe-finned fish, the pectoral girdle and the pectoral fin are much bigger than the pelvic girdle and the fin. And so the hypothesis had been that the origin of tetrapods was all about front-wheel drive, that it was those pectoral appendages that were getting big and helping to pull the animal through shallow water, or pull the animal onto land, whatever the case might be. With Tiktaalik, we showed that no, the pelvis was well developed primitively, you know, down the tree, before the early tetrapods, like the one above here. This is Acanthostega again. So with an enlarged pelvis and pelvic fin, it shows us that these earliest forms were four-wheel drive, that both sets of paired fins, pectoral and pelvic, were involved in the locomotion of these animals in whatever habitats they were using, shallow water, swampy, and eventually onto land. So it was just a slight change in paradigm there that one element helped us with. So back to this sort of idealized picture, we were talking about fins and then the adjustments to limbs and the orientation and the nature of the bones themselves. We were talking about scales and then the loss of scales in the early tetrapods. We were talking about like the connections between the head and the shoulders, so no neck mobility, yet in the early tetrapods there's neck. And we were talking about this torpedo-shaped head and the eyes on the side versus a flattened head with the eyes on top. And so blue things are sort of just very generally more primitive. Orange things are the more derived. And I could put dozens and dozens of characters up here. Features of the fins, features of the skull, etc. Just sort of subdivide this. But even in this simple thing here, we do this and you can slide Tiktaalik in between. And it's going to have some things that are blue and primitive. I'm still calling these fins because they have those lepidotrichia. That still has scales. So many aspects of the lower jaws and the teeth would be blue, still primitive. But it has orange things as well. A neck has opened up. The head is flat. The eyes are on top. So again, mosaic evolution is the term that we use for something like this, meaning all these characters aren't changing at once. You know, too many people kind of see evolution as big jumps, big changes. No. If you can go back and dissect through time, you can find that it's actually a series of small changes, and that predicting those small changes only really can happen by finding fossils that are some of those intermediates, some of those stepping stones along the way. So we did find a nice animal to fit in and kind of help us say a little bit more about this transition. Now, there's going to be more. There's countless other species which could help us more here. But as I said, it's kind of like a stepping stone. It might be a big step, but at least there's a stone there to step on before we take the next step. And now, well, through generations and generations of paleontologists and collectors and all the rest, we're going to solve some more of these. We'll keep finding organisms that keep informing the nature of this evolutionary change. This is a nice illustration by a guy named Flick Ford. He decided, and was talking to us, that Tiktaalik would be, well, we did say it was shallow water predator, and so he painted it like a muskellunge. You know, he thought, okay, that'd be a good color and pattern. I can't disagree. I should point out, nepotism, Flick Ford is my brother-in-law, and he paints fish, so this worked out very well. It's just been great. Here's the specimen actually kind of early on, and there's a wonderful artist named Ray Troll. Many of you may know Ray Troll. He does this great stuff, and so Chucky D, Embrace Your Inner Fish. This was actually before your Inner Fish book came out. So, but Ray does wonderful fossil and modern fish illustration. So One thing I haven't talked about too much is the paleogeography of what was going on in the late Devonian. The world was a very different place. If you were in orbit looking down on the Earth, you would have seen two major land masses, one which is essentially made up of North America, Greenland, and parts of Europe. We call that the Euro-American landmass. And one that was made up of what we now think of as the southern continents. We call that Gondwana. So that was South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, Australia, sort of all of this. But notice where they sit on the Earth, very different places. Euro-America was mostly south of the equator. As a matter of fact, what is now Canadian Arctic was just north of the equator. So very different climates and stuff, of course. But interestingly, these were attached. And sure enough, if we look at all the different kinds of animals, comparing our Pennsylvania sites to our Nunavut sites and to Baltic sites and other parts of Canada, we see some shared fauna. So the paleobiogeography, you know, the old life geography, has some similarities here. A few years ago, Neil Shubin, the guy in the picture who I'd done the Arctic work with, and I thought about, well, where's the next place? You know, we had thought about, we had been working in Pennsylvania and then in the Canadian Arctic. We thought, well, where's the next place where there's sort of unexplored late Devonian sediments that might inform us? It worked out good going to Canada. Maybe we should try the same thing. And we learned about stuff that was laid down in what is now Antarctica. It's, but it was sort of tropical at the time, this piece. And it's called the Aztec siltstone, and it's exposed in the Transantarctic mountain range. So we applied to the National Science Foundation and got funded. We were kind of like, oh shoot, this is going to be scary. Okay, let's do it. And we got funded, and we've done one of our trips, and I'm going to show you some pictures of the trip and talk about what we found, if I may. So first, how you go there, it's a little tricky. You fly although a lot of people get down to Antarctica and visit this Antarctic peninsula down here through South America, we needed to go all the way around the other side. So you fly across the Pacific to New Zealand, and then from New Zealand you take a military plane across to what's called McMurdo Base or McMurdo Station, far below the Antarctic Circle. There's the plane that we take across. You just sort of sit in the webbing of this C-130. Very loud, very cold, very noisy. And then you land on the Ross ice shelf. So this is glacial ice on top of the ocean, basically, but it's hundreds and hundreds of feet thick. And then they pick you up in this Terrabus, and they take you to this McMurdo Station. And this is where McMurdo is. Our goal was to head off to this area called the McMurdo Dry Valleys, about 100 miles from the station. The McMurdo Dry Valleys are part of this Transantarctic mountain range that comes across here. Now, people think of Antarctica as covered with snow and ice. It's not. It's just 98% covered with snow and ice. The rest, there's rock exposed. And that's what geologists have mapped. Not unlike up the stuff up in Canada. We could use the geological maps that had been developed, mostly by New Zealand geologists. And they had picked up fossils out there. In fact, there were there were fishes that were described from this Aztec siltstone. But no one had gone down there and made a focused effort to collect late Devonian fossils down there. So we decided we'd give it a try. That's McMurdo Station. It started as a Navy base. Then they really demilitarized Antarctica, something called the Antarctic Treaty. This is the biggest and most sophisticated base down there, but there's a New Zealand base, there's a Russian base, there's an Italian base. There's a handful of bases across Antarctica. But you can see they store a lot of fuel. Ships, twice a year, one ship comes in with fuel, one ship comes in with supplies. They have to ice break across this area out to the open ocean out there. But that's entirely how it's supplied, besides air support coming down. But I think of this, it's remarkable. It's like it's an all-inclusive vacation for scientists, basically. Not vacation, all-inclusive resort, because you go down there. They pay you, they feed you, they give you a dorm to stay in, they give you the scientific equipment that you've asked them that you're going to need. They give you food and equipment to go do your field camp. They just take care of you. They supply the helicopters. You've arranged all this with them. You've told them what your needs are going to be, and they've approved it. But it's really amazing. They facilitate research, and it's National Science Foundation essentially supporting this project. And guess who supports the National Science Foundation? Thank you guys very much. That's great. A little bit of that tax money you just sent in, you know, just a little bit, but okay. So thank you, literally, importantly. There we are, Mcmurdo Station. Really interesting, and you know, the vehicles, and there's a lot of people in the summer months, and their summer is December, January. So we do this trip. We did it in December of 2016 to January of 2017. We'll do it again now, December 18 through January 19. There's like 2,000 people living at that base. About 600 or 700 scientists that had applied and are doing every project you can imagine. Atmospheric stuff, under the ice stuff, biological, geological, glaciology, all this different stuff. It's amazing what goes down there. And paleontology, a little bit of paleontology. Helicopters are what make it possible, especially getting out to our sites. The people who work out on the ice shelf just fly fixed-wing aircrafts around. You can get rides places. Here we are flying in. This is heading into those dry valleys. And any glaciers that do come down through the dry valleys, actually, it's kind of a rain shadow, and they actually evaporate. They sublimate off. They don't melt because it's always below freezing down there. But they do disappear, these tongues of these glaciers. Now this is really well exposed Devonian rock, this kind of beige. This is all sandstones that are below the unit that we work in. These have never been shown to have fossils in them, except for maybe some trace fossils. And then this dark unit coming through here is actually a Jurassic intrusion. It's a sill that was injected in here as volcanic rock deep under the surface. So this Devonian rock was kind of injected with the basaltic sill. Here's our first camp down there. There were 6 of us on the team, basically 5 scientists and one, so they call him a mountaineer. It's someone that NSF assigns to you. It's sort of like, you know, a scientific babysitter or a scientist babysitter. We're good at, we don't do anything too stupid down there, but I think they do think of most scientists as kind of absent-minded and stuff. So this person's there for your safety, and if you got stuck in a bad storm or if there was a need for emergency medical care and stuff, this person's along. And our mountaineer loved collecting fossils, so it worked out very, very well. We each take a little personal tent that we get at the base. This is our cook tent. This is our latrine tent. We take everything, and I mean everything out. You don't leave a thing. You don't even pee on the ground. Sorry, but you save the pee and put it in a big barrel, and that goes out with us. So it's very important that way that we're really, really low impact. We don't dump dishwater out or anything like that. That's all gets saved and goes back to the base where they do treatment. Just our camp with a different view. This is a glacier coming down off the ice cap and across there. It was Christmas, so look at our little, we cut little Christmas trees. This was actually this was our, have you ever heard of a water quarry? This was our water quarry where we would cut blocks of ice, little brick size, and it's actually just packed snow, very nice. We took a carpenter's saw and you just cut down and take pieces and take them in the tent and melt them, and that was our drinking water and our washing water and all that sort of thing. And then doing our work, we had a geologist from Princeton, a guy named Adam Maloof along, so he was measuring the sections of these sedimentary rocks. This is very fine-grained, layered rock, laminated, lots of small, well-preserved little fish in there, some heavier sandstones coming down as well. And this is the stage that we just call prospecting, where we're walking around, we're looking for fossils on the surface, broken up pieces of fossils on the surface. Here we are with some bones, all of these light-colored things on these rocks, our fossil bone. Here's where we're just starting to split out. So literally we're using rocks, chisels, rock hammers, chisels, whisk brooms, and we're starting to expose layers, kind of like we did in Nunavut, where there's more and better fossils than what's right at the surface. A couple of things, these are both placoderm elements. part of the trunk of a placoderm and skull of a placoderm. Splitting the shales, wrapping the fossils, really just sort of nothing low-tech, nothing that any of you couldn't do. You know, you just get your eye for the colors and the patterns that you're looking for, and you just sit down and split. Unfortunately, it's 20 degrees and windy, but that's okay. It's so much fun. And then we use things like fossil consolidants, glues, just to make sure things travel. There's a nice placoderm that just split open in a fine shale here. This is called Bothrialepis, a very common placoderm. Skull on both sides here, body and fins. Just kind of fun. So as we're out there, sometimes it's so windy and stuff that you just all wrapped up. You know, a lot of layers and stuff at times like this. Look at, that's not clouds, that's the ice cap heading away from us. So we are right on the edge of the ice cap here, and that is just going to the South Pole. Just 1,000 miles of ice that's a mile thick or more most of the way through. So we never went out there, obviously. There's crevasses, there's a lot of reasons not to go out there, although plenty of science gets done out there. Then we had a chance to do a little more helicoptering. We went over to our second camp, and this is just some of the terrain as we crossed these dry valleys going over to our second camp. Set up second camp, beautiful. Then we had a snowstorm. It was our only big snowstorm, and it lasted a long time, but only about 6 inches of very light snow came down. But it was just a whiteout. We couldn't do our work. Just dangerous. You don't leave camp if you can't see, if you don't have good conditions. Unfortunately, the snow also covered outcrop, which was a pain. So like we were actually, this is a path we swept with our whisk brooms because we were measuring the section, measuring the thicknesses of the beds. We found a great fossil bed, and so we had to sweep it clear. And look at this slab. This was a big piece just covered with lobe-finned fish scales and skull material. Now, we didn't find anything. On this trip, we didn't find anything that helps us understand fin to limb transition. We didn't find any of those advanced lobe-finned fish. Found a lot of great fossils. We can tell some great stories about the ecosystems and stuff at the time, but nothing along those lines. Then we came in, this is a series I put together. This is what it's like when you're waiting for like 3 hours, then the helicopter finally comes to take you out. And the pilots, I think, enjoy you. So you got your pile of gear and you're kind of sitting there and you expect that they'll land away from you. No, they decide to land right on top almost. And they love the wind and the prop wash, just the snow. It's crazy. And then this is just back. One of the beauties at our first camp was being able to walk down to that glacier that came by camp, and just the blue ice hundreds of thousands of years old and compressed to be like glass. Just spectacular right there. And it's moving. You know, it's moving, although you obviously don't notice. We didn't hear it or anything like that, but it's absolutely moving through time. So here we are actually flying over. We're going out to where we'll go next year. Well, not next year, at the end of this year, December. And we're going to an area that isn't the dry valleys, but these peaks of mountains, and these include that formation, that Aztec siltstone that is our target. And so we're actually going to be going right to what you're seeing here. We don't know exactly, but we're probably going to land in fixed wing aircrafts with snowmobiles. Doesn't this sound, this sounds adventurous. Land with snowmobiles and sleds behind the snowmobiles. And we'll set up a camp and then travel by snowmobile to some of these various exposures around. So we'll have a base camp and then we'll get out and about. And these are just a couple more photos that we took from the helicopter as we were scouting where I'll be. This is apparently a very productive place. Geologists had surveyed it and found bits and pieces of fish common up here. This is called Mount Ritchie. So we really hope, at Christmas time, think of me climbing up these ridges and stuff. That's what I'll be doing. And then the last thing to mention is this stuff from our first expedition. It came back to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philly. It took a good 4 months because it came back on the ship that went down there to resupply. So you can see we built these crates, and then it says vessel, so these were loaded in, and They took a ship to California and then came across country by truck. But they've been prepared. This is just part of our museum collection, typical cabinet. And now all of that stuff that we collected, that you saw some snapshots of, in fact, there's that Placa Derm that's split open there, is cataloged, about 650 curated specimens now, whole variety of forms. Again, nothing exactly on the fin to limb transition, but interesting stuff nonetheless. As we add new material, I think already actually it's probably the largest Devonian-Antarctic collection in the world. So we're really the first people to go in and collect systematically. But we'll continue to build it, and there are numerous research projects to do down there. And just one more close-up of labeling and numbering and all the stuff that goes into curation of a collection like this. All right. I thank you for your time. Whoops, slide's a little messed up. But thank you to the Paleontological Society as well. And oh, thank you. You're very kind. And I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to repeat the questions so that the folks recording this will get the questions as well. Great question. So with all the Tiktaalik specimens we have, is there anything that might suggest there are more than one species of Tiktaalik? Yes, you might interpret some of these. For example, we see major size differences. Like we have lower jaws that are this big, and we have lower jaws that are this big. Is that age? Is that sexual dimorphism? Is it species differences? We can't really say. It's actually, there's a piece of research I've actually talked to some undergraduate students at Drexel about. Do you want to look at all the lower jaws and see if we can not only look at size, but look at the anatomy to see if there's some changing proportions of this bone versus that bone, or where the teeth are socketed and all that kind of thing. So maybe we could get at that question. At this point, you know, this gets into the classic paleontological thing. Are you a splitter or a lumper? Do you think you want to make more species, or do you think you want to kind of be conservative about it? And I'm not Edward Drinker Cope, so I want to be conservative about it. Edward Drinker Cope would name every specimen something different practically. That was more than 100 years ago. So we're going to right now say they're all one species. Again, next generation, that material is totally available. There'll be new tools. CT and that kind of things are new tools. And so who knows? It'll be really interesting. We cataloged 50 Tiktaalik specimens, 50. 4 of them were relatively complete. The rest were in isolated shoulders or jaws or pieces of snout. What other pieces do we get? Pieces of fins. So, but 50. And if you looked at it, sometimes paleontologists working at once, and it's all one site, seem to have been a very rapidly deposited like flood event that carried a lot of these carcasses, some complete, some very broken up. When you look at it, I think we have like 10 pieces of left lower jaw. So we can say that there were at least 10 individuals. Now I'm sure there were more than that, but we can definitively say there were at least 10 individuals that were falling apart there. So the question is about, do you think there's neurological change as you get this morphological, anatomical change? And I would think absolutely, but I have zero way of knowing that. You could CT brain case. I think in like dinosaurs and things, they CT brain cases and say, well, obviously this thing had a good sense of smell and stuff because that part of the brain is more well developed, or vision and all that. I don't know about the sort of where the center for driving appendages might be, and whether you would say that limbs require more neural anatomy than fins do, if that's what you're asking. So as I think you understand, paleontology is dealing with skeletal anatomy, and if there's no skeletal correlate to things like soft parts, you're not going to know what's changing in those soft parts. Do we have the teeth of Tiktaalik? Absolutely, beautifully preserved. And that whole stem tetrapod lineage, so everything earlier of the lobe-finned fish, moving up through Tiktaalik and into the early tetrapods, very similar predatory teeth, eating whatever might be available, potentially placoderms, even though placoderms have that armored body, they have softer tails and things, potentially ray-finned fish, potentially other sarcopterygian fish. So they're predatory. Nothing's eaten, and they're probably predators on bigger animals. They're not arthropods eating and such. I think it's always fascinating to think about what food, what prey items were in the more shallow water that Tiktaalik may have started to have access to. And eventually, in the 10 million years after Tiktaalik or so, what would have been the prey items that would have been on land that might have encouraged more and more ability to move in a terrestrial setting like that? And my only answer to that is arthropods. You know, insects and other arthropods of all kinds. You're not an herbivore. You're not going on land to eat leaves. That takes many, many more millions of years to develop the dentition and the digestive tract and everything to be plant eaters. So at some point, I think it is chasing down bugs on land that became it. But that's just, you can't see that in the dentition, certainly not of Tiktaalik. And then even moving up the tree to those other forms, you still don't see it. But yes, and we eat thin section teeth of Tiktaalik to look at, people have talked about the different structural features for piercing and crunching and all that kind of thing. So some of that's been done. And it's predatory is kind of the most basic level. Yeah, so what do we understand about the sort of canonical 5 digits that vertebrates settled on about 320 million years ago? You know, 5 digits has been the pattern, the primitive pattern since that time. We happen to still have it. A lot of animals have lost it. Horses have 1, you know, deer have 2, and so forth and so on. Some have, whales have elaborated, not necessarily digits, but the bones out here and such. All I can say about it is it seems to have been a stable design and genetically what they call canalized. You know, it's like it is the developmental pattern. And for one reason or another, there hasn't been, that has been the stable pattern that things don't move from. But so it developed early and it's still out there. And I honestly don't know, do you think this is particularly optimal for spreading out the pressure or whatever the case might be, so that the primate lineage kept it, and then the early mammals kept it as well, the earliest mammals? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm kind of flailing. So, this has been really great. Really great. Thank you very much.